So my study looked at climate change in general and how it's being communicated to investors. I'm going to try and build in some lessons for stranded assets for you all. So as a project background, I did 58 in-depth interviews with a range of people within the investment industry and within climate change as well. So that ranged from people at CDP to CIOs of investment banks. I also did 154 people took part in a global investor survey that I produced, looking at broader global trends. The interviews themselves were a UK-Australia comparison to try and get an understanding of how the different investment industries of the two countries were actually impacting how people were learning about climate change. This is a really important topic, I feel, because the IEA suggests that $53 trillion in investments are needed to fund this low carbon transition. So investors are going to be really key in trying to find some of that money, particularly given the lack of will among regulators and among governments. So how investors are viewing climate change and how they're learning about it is actually really important. I'm pleased that you're all here today because you're obviously interested in the subject. So just a bit of a breakdown in terms of who I interviewed. So it's executives, asset managers, investment analysts, a whole range of people were involved. And I managed to interview organisations that attributed 30% of Australian assets under management, and in the UK it was 24% of UK/Middle Eastern markets, because I interviewed some the ADIA, the Abu Dhabi Investment Bank, so needed to kind of add that into considerations. The survey was 154 people, as I already said. 38.7 were executives, and only 4.7 were ESG and RI specialists. I wanted to make that clear because some of the views later you could just say, oh, it's just because they're specialists or aware of these issues. And 40% worked in asset management. I also tried to get a good mix between asset managers and pension funds to represent a wider range of investors. So how do investors actually understand climate change and how are they viewing stranded assets? So I asked them in the global survey what terms you're actually familiar with. How would you be able to describe these to your friends and family and colleagues? And although 88% of survey respondents said they were somewhat or very familiar with sustainability issues, actually the only concept that they were familiar with, more than half were familiar with, was ESG, environmental, social and governance issues. The others, which are more climate change specific, are much less familiar to this survey audience. And in particular for today, only 29.6% knew of stranded asset risk. This suggests that there's a large part of the market that still don't know what we're talking about. And I think that that's a really key thing to take away from today, is that there's much more to do just on the basic communication of what this term means and how it is impacting everybody's portfolios. Also, key to note is the 34.4% who know of the 2 degrees target. I think this is really key because if the other more than half don't know about the 2 degrees target, if you don't know about the 2 degrees target, to me, that means that you won't understand things like the carbon budgets, you won't understand the policy urgency of some of the things we're talking about. So I think that much more needs to be done on just communicating the basics, and I'll go into that a bit later. We've already seen asset stranding happen around the world, and companies investing in water security, gas-fired power stations closing down. So if people aren't aware of these things, we need to make them more aware. And that's a role for both academics like myself and the Smith School, but also for industry people like yourselves who are aware of these issues, to make sure that we're communicating them clearly and showing the immediacy of these issues. We also wanted to ask how they define climate change and looking at what issues they're thinking about, whether it's risk or opportunities, and how they're thinking about these issues. So asked people to rank 4 different issues, so evolving social norms, new technology developments, regulatory risk, and physical risk. And this slide shows that regulatory risk is the issue that most people are thinking about when they're talking about climate change. 43.3% rank this as most important. I think that's a good thing for stranded assets in the fact that regulatory risk is one of those things that is going to be causing stranded assets. So if they're thinking about that, they can be thinking about how this is going to affect stranded assets. Interestingly, evolving social norms was the least likely to affect investment decisions, and that's interesting considering the recent media around divestment campaigns. Actually, investors aren't thinking about that as having an effect, and is their least important idea around climate change. So going back to the interviews and what people think are more important, risk or opportunity. Stranded asset risk talks a lot about the risk, but actually people are thinking about risk and opportunity equally. And that might be something to think about, is how we can talk about what investments are going to benefit and might be an opportunity from potential stranded assets. So let's talk about the information availability. In academic research, there's a dichotomy between too much information overload, which we all suffer from in terms of we have our inboxes and our mobiles, just completely inundated with information, but also not knowing the right amount of information and not knowing the information that will be beneficial. So when asked, do you feel there's enough information available on corporate exposure to climate risks? 58.2% said no, and only 20% said yes. This is a huge market that we should be tapping into to provide more information about what is going on and how this is affecting investment decisions. We then asked what information people would actually like and what they feel that they're not getting enough of at the moment. So 18.3% said none of the options given. That suggests that actually a large proportion still need more information, and data on how climate change is affecting portfolio and economy returns was the key for the vast majority of people. And that's why the work of CDP, True Cost and Sustainalytics are actually doing really good work, but could be doing more. Both UK and Australian interviewees wanted more high-profile case studies and mainstream cover of the materiality of climate change, and that's something I'll build on later. But interestingly, it was also the timelines of how and when these issues are going to become stranded and how and when these are going to materialise in their portfolios. One interviewee says, unless you can put a value and timeline on the stranding, then it isn't helpful for an investor. I mean, you can discuss that yourself, but obviously modelling and how to work out some policy pipelines are going to be really key. Is the academic work and the issues in mainstream media relevant for investors? This suggests not. Different survey participants say that climate change communications were too nebulous and nuanced, too politicised, full of jargon or difficult to follow, and alarmist arguments that are not helpful. And I think we can all agree that we've read some of the Guardian articles that maybe aren't helping, and are just leading to, and aren't providing any feedback for investors of how to actually respond in a practical way. And this is what was a key finding from my research, is that actually, if you provide a 100-page or a 500-page IPCC report, investors are not going to read that. So we need to make sure that we provide enough information in a relevant and timely manner that actually builds on their own understandings and ideas of risk and reward and opportunity. One of the key barriers to this is a lack of research budget. So only 0.9% said that they had external research budgets for climate change. I worked with an economic consultancy last summer called Absolute Strategy Research, and they had employed a climate change expert to provide analysis, but then had to let them go because there just wasn't enough money in it for them. They didn't, because people, the investors weren't, and the clients weren't buying the research, they're not going to provide it. So we need to make sure that investors are asking for this information and willing to pay for it if they see it affecting investment portfolios. So what scale of information is required? This just goes through different interviewees' ideas of what information they need relating to stranded assets and climate change. So company information, company-specific information that they can introduce into their asset allocations and their daily decision-making is fundamental. But also thematic was highlighted, and I think that's really important for stranded assets because it's a thematic trend, and people are willing to listen to the macroeconomic issues. Interestingly, this varied, based on who I was talking to. Executives wanted the global, the thematic, and the asset class information. Non-executives wanted the company and sector issues. Equity analysts wanted the company issues. Bonds wanted the regional and global issues. We need to make sure that we are targeting our information provision to different groups so that they're getting what they need. And there was also a difference between Australia and the UK. Australia, as a smaller investment market, was more directly interested in what was going on with global and particularly the Asian markets. So they wanted the global and regional. And because they've got smaller sectors with only one or two companies, the sector and company research wasn't actually that different. So we need to make sure that we're targeting the information we provide. So what communication channels do people want? So this just shows again that there is a market for information. The last time people read reports, 42% had read a report about climate change in the last week. You've got to remember that only 4% of these survey participants were ESG specialists. So that suggests that there is a market for this in the wider mainstream investment analysts. So what sources were people using? So brokers and data providers were key in this for providing information. And I think that's really important, particularly given the dominance of financial data providers in this list, that people are getting this information alongside their financial data. So we need to make sure that the Bloombergs and the MSCIs of this world are providing this information rather than just academics and climate change specialist groups. I'll make one further point here, is that consultants in the UK was only mentioned by 1 in 3 of 30. So I think the consultants can be doing a lot more to try and make this an issue. And that could be a whole other presentation, so I won't go into that. This is the survey results of the same question. And mainstream news came up a bit more, as 81% use mainstream news to gather their information. So this is really key of making sure that academics and practitioners that have the best information on climate change and how it relates to investors are getting it through these mainstream news channels, and it doesn't just become alarmist and politicized. We need to make sure that this unbiased research is getting through these channels because it does affect investment decisions. Again, with the broker reports and external research and data providers. Investment journals as well, but also internal research. And I think that's where some of the ESG and the RI teams have a big role to play. This is how investment decisions are made, not based on climate change, based on all information. And again, it's the market providers. So if the market providers aren't being given the information, then they won't be impacting investment decisions. Discussions with colleagues is also really important. So you need to make sure that this information is getting through the informal discussions that people are having and the formal meetings. And I'll talk a bit more about that now. So I've also looked at the formal and informal learning strategies that investors use. And I'd be interested to hear your own personal experience of this. This is just based on my survey and my sample. So this notes the dominance of informal learning strategies. So if you're not enjoying this presentation, it doesn't matter, but I hope you get something out of the coffees and the dinners later today, that you can talk to other people and you can learn a bit more from them. You don't need to learn anything from me, that's fine. But also that both formal and informal learnings are important. So you can't just go around to conferences and meetings and just chat to people. You also need to make sure that you're informed yourself. So you need to make sure that you're reading the formal reports and getting the relevant data. Formal meetings and investment committee meetings are key to determining whether this information is going to have a strategic level impact on investment. And this shows that climate change is not an issue in the current investment committee meetings. And that's a real issue if you want this to have a wider impact throughout the investment supply chain. So I say that that's a really key takeaway from this presentation, is that we need to make sure that this is getting to the top level of investment organisations. Otherwise, it just won't be talked about enough. Talking to clients and colleagues. Well, 58% say they do it sometimes. Only 2.7% say they do it always or often. And that's when we talked about the fact that there's the need for informal and social learning. That's really where this falls down, that we need to get more people talking about the issues with stranded assets and more talking about climate change in order for this to have an impact on investment decisions. So peer learning is a key idea within social learning theories in academia. And it's the idea of just talking to each other, talking to your friends, your colleagues, your clients, and having discussions on an informal basis. And I really like this quote. I talk to my peers about how they are looking at certain issues. You don't necessarily tell them everything, but over time you develop a group that you trust, and an informal, smaller group who you might talk to a bit more candidly. I think it is hugely important in our field, and that information is very useful for us to take internally to use as leverage. It helps you push things through. I think that's really key to try and get, especially if climate change or responsible investment teams within investment banks who might not have direct access to investors. If you can talk to your peers about what they're doing, learn some good practices, what's worked, what hasn't worked, that could be really key to pushing these agendas forward. How much do we have? Okay. So I'll finish with this idea of communities of practice. So this builds on the idea of peer learning and the fact that we need to build up small groups of individuals working within investment in the city and abroad as well, to talk to each other and learn about these best practices, particularly at the executive level. I know it's harder due to issues of Chinese rules and confidentiality, but there are some groups that have been developed on climate change, and I would suggest we need to do the same thing on stranded assets. I mean, the Smith School's already doing some good work on that, but getting small groups together that can help push things through and work on collaborative projects will be really important to kind of socialise these messages and make them much more accessible and understood, and start to build up case studies of how this can happen in practice and how it can be introduced into the investment committee. So there are some key quotes from my research. They're all included in my paper, so I won't go into them too much now. Just beware that this isn't an answer to everything. As I said earlier, you need to make sure that you're reading the informal, the formal policies, practices, and also the latest climate science as well, because there are issues around groupthink and herding. And assuming that best practices exist, you all need to make sure that this is relevant to your own business. There's not one solution for everyone. But there does need to be cross-pollination of ideas within groups, because communities of practice can become very close-knit, and if you're not getting ideas from elsewhere, then that also leads to issues. I'll skip over changing the investment system, but it's in my paper. But the fact that some people think there's too much information. So information, just providing more information won't solve everything, but I don't have time to go into that. So my main conclusions are trying to get mainstream information channels to provide the best information possible. And including social media, a lot of people talked about how social media can actually be really good for filtering and sharing information. Key concepts are still not fully understood, so we need to work on that. And the academic world, but also the professional world, has a role to play in that. We need to adopt investor-relevant language, emphasising both risk and opportunity. But we also need to develop and support peer learning through communities of practice.